I long to know what the U.S. would look like if it had never been legal to capture and sell and own other human beings. Agriculture certainly would have developed differently. Wealth would be distributed very differently. Most of us carry the psychological scars of slavery. I grew up for a time in the early and mid-'60s in North Carolina, and I was taught about the institution of slavery. Most people were kind to their slaves, my teachers said. After emancipation, many slaves chose to stay with their masters because they loved them so much. Lincoln freed the slaves with the Emancipation Proclamation. In my child mind, I pictured this proclamation being read aloud in the courtyards and the city centers of U.S. towns, and joyous black faces and emotional white faces listening to this proclamation as the white folks said, "So long, it's been great having you." I didn't think about slavery much because as a young white child, I had the privilege of not thinking about it if I didn't want to. I remember the first time I heard as an adult the phrase enslaved men and women, and it jolted me. It was different. I had always heard people called slaves as if they were some kind of category of human being that was a little bit of a different category. But when you say enslaved men and women, you think, oh, this speaks about a process of enslavement of men and women. And so you start to think, well, I am not enslaved right now, but there's a process by which I could be. So I don't like saying the word slaves anymore. I like saying enslaved men and women as a way of keeping the process in the terminology. So Juneteenth celebrations are here in Austin next Saturday, most of them. There's a parade, there's a gathering in the park, there are beauty contests and barbecue. This is how Texans celebrate a holiday. And other states have Juneteenth celebrations too, but it's only a state holiday in Texas and Oklahoma. And the celebrations commemorate the beginning of the enforcement of the Emancipation Proclamation in Texas. See, when I first started reading about Juneteenth, they were saying things like, everybody else was free 2.5 years before, and we didn't find out about it in Texas for 2.5 years. And I'm thinking, wow, that's hard to imagine. But really, it was way more complicated than that. And, you know, when people say, oh, things in the past used to be so much simpler, it's just because they've forgotten about the complications. So, see, the Emancipation Proclamation didn't free that many people. It was Lincoln's idea to free the enslaved men and women gradually. Because, you know, the people in power like to make changes gradually. It's more comfortable. And he wanted to financially compensate those folks who had owned these enslaved men and women, thinking of them as their property. But nobody went for that. The Emancipation Proclamation was punitive in nature. It was written after the Battle of Antietam in Maryland, September of 1862. One-day battle, guess how many young men died? 22,717. It was a slaughter in a cornfield, young men slaughtering each other. So that happened in September. Lincoln wrote the proclamation right after that and said that as of January 1st of the next year, 1863, all enslaved men and women in states that were still in rebellion against the Union would be freed as of that January 1st. Because, the states that were not in rebellion against the Union, the Emancipation Proclamation didn't apply to the enslaved men and women in those states. Everybody in the North got to keep things the same. And, of course, in the southern states, the authority of President Lincoln to proclaim anything was not recognized, so the enslaved men and women in the South had their lives pretty much go on as usual, except just add war to it. And then I thought that the war ended with Lee's surrender at Appomattox. Weren't you taught that? Lee surrendered at Appomattox April 1865. So what he surrendered was the Virginia armies. And then there were other armies, Confederate armies in Florida that had to surrender separately. And then there were armies in North Georgia that didn't surrender till later. And there were armies in the West that didn't surrender until later. So the war kind of dribbled on. And the West was a different kind of situation because there'd been a lot of resistance to the spread of the institution of slavery into the states like Kansas and Nebraska that were about to become part of the Union but weren't yet. And Kansas wanted to enter the Union as a free state, but other people, in most of the history books that I read, they were called border ruffians. But the border ruffians were pro-slavery, and they wanted Texas to enter the Union as a slave state. And so this is 1850s. There were a lot of skirmishes. There was bloodshed. John Brown was a white man who felt that as an abolitionist, the only way slavery was going to go away was with armed revolt. And a lot of the abolitionists in the North felt that way too and gave money to John Brown, bought arms for John Brown, including our own Ralph Waldo Emerson and his friends in Concord, Massachusetts, the Transcendentalists. They helped arm John Brown. I'm not sure how they felt when John Brown's followers slaughtered a family of 5 in Texas who were said to be pro-slavery. But the Free Soil folks skirmished and killed and died with the pro-slavery folks. And it wasn't really that the Free Soil folks were that opposed to slavery on moral grounds, although they may have been. But what they said they were doing was keeping it fair because people who were allowed to use enslaved men and women on their farms were going to be economically way ahead of people who had to pay their laborers on their farms. And they just didn't want people who owned other men and women to come in and have an unfair farming advantage in the beautiful soil of Kansas. Horace Greeley, who was with the New York Times, called Kansas Bleeding Kansas. Now, another little interesting parenthetical note, Horace Greeley's father, Horace Greeley Sr., had been the first president of the American Unitarian Association. So after General Lee's surrender, Union troops were already in the South, and they were able to make some space for the newly freed men and women to live. And the laws of Reconstruction made it possible, even mandatory, for the governments of those states to have African American folks in the governing bodies. But that didn't last very long. Going back to Texas and the surrenders, so Lee's surrender in April didn't end, really, the war. Texas had given 70,000 troops to the Confederacy. A lot of slave holders had brought the men and women that they had enslaved to Texas to wait the war out because Texas was kind of liberal on this issue, except Mexico was not. It was illegal in Mexico. A lot of enslaved men and women ran away across the border and ended up in Mexico. But there was also Texas was called the back door to the Confederacy because when the blockades the Union blockades were running all along the Atlantic coast, cotton was smuggled across the border of Texas into Mexico, over to Europe. Money was brought back to Mexico, up through Texas, and supplied the Confederate troops through Texas. So that was our part that we played in that war. Now, Appomattox was in April. General Kirby Smith didn't surrender until May 26th. It was signed on June 2nd. So those Texas troops surrendered on June 2nd. The last battle of the American Civil War was the Battle of Palmito Ranch in Texas on May 12th and 13th of 1865. The last significant Confederate active force to surrender was the Confederate allied Cherokee Brigadier General Stand Watie and his Indian soldiers on June 23rd. Why were the Cherokees fighting with the Confederacy? Because, as you will remember, many of the First Nations were slaveholding nations, and the Cherokees owned slaves. So it wasn't as if the enslaved men and women in Texas labored all in ignorance for 2.5 years while the rest of their cousins, mothers, brothers, sisters in the South were free and happy. No, nobody really was free until those months in the spring of 1865. General Granger, Union General, and 2,000 Union troops sailed into Galveston on June 19th, which is what we celebrate. The war was still in its last gasps. General Granger brought Order Number 3 with the following statement informing enslaved men and women of their new status as freed Americans. Quote, "The people of Texas are informed that in accordance with a proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves, and the connection heretofore existing between them becomes that between an employer and a free laborer." Federal troops were there to enforce that rule. So the Texas Juneteenth celebrations commemorate that date when the proclamation was read, and for it to be read in a meaningful way, it was not left up to the states to vote on whether they wanted their slaves freed or not. It was a federal law. And in every skirmish where states say, we don't have to pay attention to the federals as they legislate for us, it should just be the states, every interaction like that ends up with the federals winning. And so, this still goes on today as people in various states are saying, we don't have to pay attention to the Supreme Court. It's like, just look at 1865, my people, and you will realize that the federals win. And states, when left to legislate for themselves, are often not as liberal as the whole country voting together. So what do? You're suddenly free, and the proclamation has said, you're probably going to just stay where you were, enslaved, and then suddenly your guy has to pay you now. You're the employee now. How many people are really going to stand there in the same place where they were beaten, treated like property? Probably not too many. Many people just heard it and went, Yahoo, and left. Some people made the choice to stay and become sharecroppers. Sharecropping is an ancient institution from before feudal times, really, where you work land that's owned by somebody else, and they take a portion of the crop, and you take a portion of the crop to pay for yourself and your family throughout the year. But a lot of times you run out of money throughout the year because that portion of the crop is not enough, and so the landowner graciously loans you the money against your next crop, and so pretty much you're in the hole forever. To the landowner, it's not a great way to live. Land is the basis of wealth. If you cannot own land, you cannot become wealthier over the generations. Some freed men and women were given land, but then much of that land was taken back from them by President Andrew Jackson. White settlers were given land in the West, and black settlers were not. That basis of wealth for European Americans has not been available for black Americans. Some brown Americans had land to begin with. Some managed to buy land. It is the freed slaves that were opposed at every turn in their attempts to start a life as freed people. They were supposed to, according to this proclamation, have equal property rights, but my friends, you know that didn't last very long, as laws were made against people of color owning property. Even now, until recent times, I'll just go on and say it, even now, black families sometimes have obstacles in buying a house where they want to buy a house. There are obstacles that have been placed in front of black folk trying to build a life. Sometimes these separate but equal schools were not quite equal. Textbooks were old. There were holes in the roof. The teachers were not as good. The money was not there. I didn't have to think about that as a child either. I do have a memory one time of my mother pointing out a building across a field and saying, "Honey, that's where the little black children go to school." 1964. At every turn, there have been Jim Crow laws and violent enforcers there to remind the black folks among us that their place in society would be maintained with violence. And we saw this in video after video after video this year. How about if we are among the people who help people among us who are trying to start a life and build a life? You guys are helping Sulma, to whom we have offered sanctuary. She's living here at the church. She's having to start all over again. She lost her business. She lost the $15,000 bond that she had to put up. You're helping her start again. I want you to feel that deeply in your heart. And we continue that work by standing against the systematized sitting down on people, acting as if somehow black bodies are to be treated differently from white bodies. The boy filming the video at the pool party said they acted like I was invisible because I was white. They were just targeting all the black kids. Did you know that in studies, white people tend to see black children as older than they are? White people tend to see black children as more threatening than white children. This is really important. It's really important to search our own hearts for the vestiges of those terrible years that still remain with us, and for us to be among the folks who stand as allies for those who are black and brown among us and say, what do you need us to do? May we find a way.